Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Daily Friend Show, the best source for news and analysis in South Africa and perhaps, dare I say, the world. Well, I may be biased. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you?
I am fine, thanks, Nick, and I'm quite excited too. I think this will be the first time I'm visible on the podcast since we moved to this, seeing people shtick, which I'm still not quite happy with. I'm very 1920s in that regard. But I'm just saying that if the viewership numbers tank from this point forward, we know why.
Don't worry, my plan always was to blame you. And joining us on the podcast for I think the second time ever and the first time ever on YouTube is Mr. Duwayne Esau. Duwayne, how are you doing?
I'm well, Nick. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty good. It is very cloudy in Joburg. I don't know how it is in the rest of the country, but it is fairly grim and dark here. So let us talk about the grim task of our age, and that is what the IRR is doing all the time. So you may have noticed from the show we did last week when we talked to our CEO, Frans Cronje, and Chief of Staff, John Endres. It's a great episode. Do check it out. We're currently engaged in a battle against expropriation without compensation, which is a policy program by the government which will destroy property rights in South Africa. Now, there's a reason that we are making such a big fuss about it right now. Herman, tell us about why it's such a big deal to talk about this now, because it's been ongoing for years, right? And we've been bringing it up again and again, but right now it's particularly important. Why is that?
Yeah, I within the very short context, it's that a week from now, the 10th of February, comments close for the Expropriation Bill. Now, the Expropriation Bill was introduced last year by Minister Patricia de Lille, and it's a piece of legislation, the proposed legislation that will repeal essentially large parts of the 1975 Expropriation Act. Now, the 1975 Expropriation Act needs fixing. It's quite old, and it is significantly pre-constitution. It has some weird stuff about parliamentary sovereignty. So the long and short of it is, it really is in need of some tender-loving care. The problem is that the ANC and Patricia de Lille, they're using this to advance the ideology of expropriation without compensation, the ideology of hostility and antagonism towards property rights. Now, the Expropriation Bill in and of itself isn't a problem. Most countries in the world have expropriation legislation where, for example, if the government wants to build a highway, but there's, a pig in the way, they can do something about it. So it's not per se a controversial piece of legislation to look at. But the real problem in South Africa is that it's expropriation without compensation. That's the core thing here, is that it's not compensation is one of those inbuilt elements that protects property rights, because you might lose your property rights on one thing, but you receive something in return. Something becomes yours that wasn't yours before, so right. You might not always be happy with it.
Yeah, so I think that's an important thing. I don't think any of us are too wild about expropriating property from private individuals for the government, but there's a very big principal difference between taking it with compensation and without, because with compensation keeps a sort of more level pegging, I suppose, between the state and the individual. Because
Absolutely.
Basically you're saying the state has to give you something. It's not your master, it's not your ruler. It has to it has to compensate you. It still owes you something.
Yes, and if we think about normal economics, compensation is actually the strongest protector of property rights in just usual things. The question, have you paid for that, is a very good idea. If you've paid for it, that means you've compensated the person whose it was, and it is now yours. So the idea of compensation with expropriation is still something that makes me uncomfortable. Don't get me wrong, but something that makes me uncomfortable wouldn't be the word, like nauseous and existentially dreadful, is this without compensation bit.
Right. We might say it's unguided policy with compensation, but
Mm.
without compensation, it's a threat to the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. And that's essentially what this expropriation bill now does. It uses the excuse of the outdated 1975 Act to bring in this new piece of legislation. I was disproportionately chuffed the other day when I wrote a press release under the heading "Delow the lies and the property rights." Because if we look at what has happened over these last few months, that's what we've seen is President Ramaphosa's cabinet and in the form of Patricia de Lille has straight up told porkies to the South African public. They've straight up fibbed about this. They say it's not just it's strictly about land. No, it isn't. The bill itself makes provision for property not limited to land. They say that there are limited circumstances in which nil compensation would be applicable. That's not the case. So the reason to by endless meander come back to something resembling an answer to your original question is, why do we care about it now? Well, because we're a week away from the deadline of people being able to submit public opposition or support, if you be so inclined, on this bill that purports to be just legislative housekeeping, but actually presents a significant threat. I would say even perhaps more of a threat than the Section 25 amendment of the Constitution, because that one at least has the fanfare of the Bill of Rights being altered. So it comes with some gravity. The Expropriation Bill is just straight up parliamentary legislation. The ANC can just pass it with its simple majority. So a week from now, comments on that close, and we really need to ramp up opposition to this. And perhaps later, I would like to come back to the issue of why should people comment? Is it useful at all? But I think I've spoken quite enough for now. And perhaps Mr. Esau has, I don't know, perhaps he has interesting thoughts. I'm yet to hear one from him, but he's a
Duwayne, what have you been? Because of course you work with Hermann a lot. What have you guys kind of been up to? How have you been operating with regards to trying to fight against this bill?
So what we do is we're trying to gather support from the public, because obviously the institute can only do so much. We need broader support from the public in order to oppose this thing, because if the government sees that there's sort of a broad opposition in the country to the bill, then maybe they'll think twice about implementing it and passing it through Parliament. Because as things stand, as Hermann pointed out just now, the ANC can pass this bill in Parliament because they have a simple majority, and the opposition parties cannot really do anything about it. So our best hope is ultimately to submit enough public comments to make the government reconsider the very idea of the expropriation bill. And what we have been trying to do is to make clear to people how this bill will affect them in a very material way, i.e. affect all the material possessions.
Right.
And one thing that I think we must add here is that people often get the idea of what a think tank like the IRR does wrong. Yes, we try to convince Parliament. Yes, we try to convince government. But it's like a public debate. When you debate publicly against someone, of course you want to convince that person, but you kind of go into the debate knowing that you're not going to convince them. So you're kind of playing for the audience to get them involved, to change their mind. So when we gun for government, people often just roll their eyes and say you're just running into a brick wall. Well, we know that we are not always going to have success with government, but what we're trying to do is mobilize South Africans, because one of my favorite little tidbits of statistic is that the ANC won the 2019 election with just over 10 million votes at a time when 35 million South Africans were entitled to vote. So there's an apathy, there's an uninvolvement that we must remedy, because yes, we can change this country if only we get people who are not engaged currently in the process engaged in it.
Right, and I think another important thing here is that in the war against EWC, this is really just one battle. Now, last week we had Franz Grenier talk about the battle of ideas, but one of the key parts of the battle of ideas is that the ANC, their theory of revolution, of how to advance the national democratic revolution, that is their sort of total control over society and its transformation into a socialist system, is very much based on the idea that when the balance of forces is in your favor, you advance, and when it's not in your favor, you halt. And so whenever companies, citizens, whatever it is, don't respond to advancing the agenda of the national democratic revolution, then the ANC pushes forward very aggressively. We've seen this in places like in mining. That's a very good example. Companies there largely sort of said, "Oh well, we have to work with the government. If we give over to them and we're very cooperative, they'll give us a good deal, and then we can go back to business. It won't be what we really want, but it's a kind of compromise." What did the government do? They pushed through almost everything they wanted on the mining charter. Not everything, but close to. And as a result, mining has really been strangled in this country. So it's important that at every single step along the way, ordinary people take a stand, think tanks take a stand, business takes a stand, whatever, to slow things down, because then the ANC will see that there's popular resistance and they might at least slow it down, which gives us time to fight the larger battle of ideas to undermine the foundations of why people think that this is even acceptable legislation.
Yeah, it's the whole fallacy of a seat at the table, that if you have a seat at the table, you have influence. And the corporate South African, we saw this with prescribed assets last year, and we saw this with EWC last year, and we'll probably see it again this year, is that corporations don't want to rock the boat because that would cost them a seat at the table. And if they don't have a seat at the table, they don't have influence. It's that fallacy of seat at the tableism that we want to get exposed. But also, we can look at some successes that we've achieved. Earlier today, someone asked, what's the point of all this? What's the point of getting public comment on legislation? Won't the government and parliament do what it wants to do in any case? Possibly. It's a bit like cooking with salt. You can't necessarily taste when there's salt in the food, but you can certainly taste when it isn't there. I can't promise you that we will win if you fight with us, but I can promise you we will lose if you don't. So that's the first thing. Let's not be so encapsulated in this idea of predeterminism and status quoism. We can change things, but we can only do it if you engage. We're not guaranteed of good results if you engage, but we're guaranteed of bad results if you don't. But then we can point to something like last year's Electoral Laws Amendment Bill, where we followed a similar process and we got 13,000 South Africans to stand with us, where we as the IRR identified that this piece of proposed legislation opens the door to electronic voting, that opens the door to significantly undermining the integrity of elections. And we were surprised by the response we got, not from the public, we were glad about that, but the committee in Parliament actually came back to us and said, the concerns you raised are good concerns. They called the IEC to give them more evidence. The IEC couldn't give proper evidence, and that part of the bill was changed. Why? Because we got people involved and because people took the fight seriously enough to say not, it's a done deal. Sometimes it might be, right, but it's the difference between trying and not trying. If you're not trying, of course you're going to fail.
Right. Duwayne, you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yes, I believe what Hermann says is correct. We are often too eager to sort of give up the fight before we have even entered the ring, as it were. And you risk losing when you enter the ring. You risk getting sort of a few punches on the face here and there. But what we can guarantee you is that if you don't get in the ring, you'll lose absolutely, because then you don't have a fighting chance. If you get in the ring with us and you help us fight this, then of course we can do things and we can fight the government on legislation that should not even be on the table in the first place. But unfortunately, the institute is not sort of omnipresent. We can't do everything. So that's why we often go to the public.
What? How long have you been sitting on this information?
If you read a lot of media, you'd think that we're behind everything. We're behind the DA. We're behind Forum.
Yes, it's just like out of frame, I've just got Joe Biden and Helen Ziller and John Steenhuisen just there, two sugars, please. But apparently that's as I learned in my time at the institute, it's tragically not the case. We can only fight the battle of ideas, and the reason there's a reason fascists and dictators always burn the books and shoot the authors first, because fascists often understand the power of ideas far better than liberals and freedom-loving people.
Right.
Indeed.
So how can people join the fight, Herman? How can they submit comments? How can they support the IRR? What's the practical step here?
Yeah, so the most obvious practical step is go onto the website at irr.org.za/campaigns, and the second thing listed there, I think, will be this campaign, where you can click on it and you can go into the submission box, fill in your details there, and that goes as an endorsement of the IRR's opposition of the Expropriation Bill. Now, that opposing submission was written by Anthea Jeffrey, who is, just fundamentally brilliant. I was listening to a presentation she gave earlier today, and it's scary, the level of how potent the NDR can creep through these little crevices of simple majority legislation. So yeah, please go make a submission on that page. That goes to Parliament. It strengthens the hand against it. But then beyond that, become involved. People are obviously listening to this, so there's a level where we can engage with them. But we published today an issue alert that is also on the website at irr.org.za/media. It's the top one there, where Anthea in 5-6 pages summed up the core failures of this bill. So first thing is get involved, and second thing is get informed, and then become an active spreader of ideas. If we're living in an age where you can infect people with a cough, well, then, the same principle is that you can infect people with an idea. You become a super spreader of good ideas. You might be annoying at parties, but you might not, you might end up with my social life. So let me just put it that way. But the thing is that you give this country a shot. You give this country a chance, because I think France always refers to this quote. The Vietnam War wasn't lost in the jungles of Vietnam. It was lost in the living rooms of Middle America, because that's where the sentiment changed, and that filtered through all the way to the senators, the congressmen, and ultimately to the White House, and led to the end of the war there and America's retreat. So don't underestimate what the climate of opinion can accomplish.
Right, exactly. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the march of critical race theory through so many institutions has in a large part been driven exactly by this kind of behavior of where I'm sure we've all run into someone like this in our lives. Someone who we might call in older days, before the term became overused, a social justice warrior, right? Who just never stops talking about their issues. Now, we obviously don't endorse that completely, because we think that some parts of life shouldn't be political. But if the kind of people who just never let go of an issue, who just go on and on about it, a lot of other people will just eventually they'll either take it on board, or it'll shape their view in some way, or they'll say, you know what, maybe this is important because you keep going on and on about it.
You wear them down. Right. And I think Duwayne knows a bit about wearing down, because he went to what's that mountainous thing? Is it the Hill or Hobbiton? Oh no, it's UCT. Where about wearing down and about all Duwayne, manner of fun things.
I do indeed.
Duwayne, tell us a little bit about your time at Progress there, and fiddling around with the difficult ideological environment that is South African universities.
Oh, where do I begin? My word. I'm actually in the process of reading a book by Hayek where he goes into how the liberal economists convinced the world that the free market is a good idea back when everyone thought it wasn't. And he said that you don't start with the politicians, you start with journalists and college professors. That's where you start. And I think
Hayek called them the second-hand traders or something.
Yes, exactly. And the reason why I think the sort of atmosphere, climate on university campuses has changed is in large part due to university professors sort of indoctrinating students. And a bunch of us saw this, a bunch of us who used to attend UCT and work at UCT as well. We saw the climate changing, I would say if I had to sort of give a time frame, after fees must fall, the climate change, because then student leaders, your radical student leaders especially, saw they could get away with a lot by simply making these irrational demands of sort of university management. And what we try to do is sort of turn things around. Because a lot of students simply do not have the time nor the energy to get involved in sort of these political debates, but they do want to sort of have their say about it. But the climate became so toxic, and I'm sure you guys know this because you are active on Twitter, where if you say anything that goes against the grain, against the mainstream, you get crucified for it. Virtually, you get sort of you get shunned by the broader community. And that's where we are at right now on South African universities. We've seen this on the news happening in America with the whole free speech debate and the culture wars in the US. Under our noses in South Africa, the exact same thing is happening, where students are being radicalized in their first years of university.
Right. And that's in a sense, that's kind of where the problem with expropriation without compensation, to bring it back, kind of starts, because a lot of the societal, impetus, force behind these things, the respectability of that idea comes from universities. When someone in the ANC Youth League stands up and says, we must take the land without paying for it, most of the elite in South Africa kind of goes, yeah, but unless they're already in the ANC, they're kind of a bit sort of hesitant. But when someone with 14 PhDs says it, it has a very different impact. They can get on TV. They can, get. Well, it says something about the ANC Youth League that they probably struggle to get on TV these days. But it has an impetus that goes way beyond just the halls of Luthuli House. It has an impact across society, and that's why it's important to fight that battle. Although, of course, like we said at the beginning, it's important to slow down the sort of front end of the thing, which is in this case the Expropriation Bill.
Yeah, there's a level at which people must care about freedom as much as the Black Lives Matter activists care about stoking racial division, or at least their ideology. I think one of the problems with liberals and freedom-loving people generally is there's a kind of leave us aloneism, live and let live, because we believe in liberty and in freedom, and that means kind of we want to do our own thing, be left alone. We can't really afford to cede the ground. We can't afford to cede the public comments on the bill, for example. We can't afford to not attend EWC public hearings. So there's a level at which if you care about these things, you must care about them. And you must also understand that, I don't think there's something bigger really here. Yes, of course, focus on your family, your jobs, or those things are your immediate concerns, but you see them within the context of a changing ideological world and start seeing the connections between things that change from culture and spill over ultimately until it affects your immediate surroundings. So don't be so blind to what affects your immediate surroundings by caring about your immediate surroundings, important as they are, but also, take the broader view. Something France is for example very, very, very good at, and constantly reminds us to do.
Right. Any closing thoughts from either of you guys before we just do a quick summary of other things we've been up to and other exciting developments in the country?
Well, make a submission.
Yeah, make a submission.
Definitely.
Good stuff.
And I do think the point that Hermann has made now about sort of taking the broader view, because I think the difficulty with legislation such as the Expropriation Bill is that people cannot see how it affects them materially or how it would affect them materially, because the legislation is so far removed from them. Whereas with the Electoral Laws Amendment Bill, we could say that the way we vote will change, which was more tangible. And I think a lot of people sort of realize that much more quicker than us making the argument that if the law changes, it's not limited to land only, but all property. And I think the people have sort of difficulty in sort of getting at the idea. But I do think, as Hermann said, sort of get involved and get informed, and do not simply think about your sort of day-to-day life. Think about the broader changes that's happening in the country and look at things from that perspective. I mean, you wouldn't enjoy it if, let's say, 5 years from now, you are a tenant of the state instead of owning your house. No one wants that. And you wouldn't want the state to come and seize your pension or your stocks or whatever you own and your nice little savings that you've saved up. That's not a pleasant thing. And that's ultimately where this bill is headed.
And don't then in 5 years say, oh, if only someone had told us.
I think it's also important to, considering the broader view, to think of this as it is one battle. So even if this piece of legislation goes through, it's not the end of the fight. The fight goes on until liberty is restored. What's that saying? There are no truly lost causes because there are no truly won causes. And hold on, if I can lay on another piece of over-the-top historical grandiose quotes, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So there we go. That's all the cliches in one. Let's, in the last sort of 4 minutes here, what else have you guys in campaigns been up to, Hermann and Duwayne?
Well, EWC, big one, but then we've got a few other campaigns at play that have also made a few waves. We came out swinging against the race-based tourism equity fund. We took on the president when he said, 2021 must be the year of BEE, making the case that BEE has failed, that South Africans have suffered because of it, that Black South Africans have not been empowered by it, and that there are better alternatives. We've had a good campaign on hashtag power to the people, which is essentially just saying, run Eskom like a sensible thing. Keep it there as, that buffer of the way I see the state being. The state must be the buffer between the necessary creative destruction of the market and the people who might suffer the consequences of that creative destruction. That's kind of the way I see the state. So keep Eskom in that context, but open the market, make it depoliticize it. And we've had some very interesting, we might be able to report back on some interesting developments in a few weeks' time on that score, on that campaign. But let's just say that we might engage at a high level to make sure that these arguments are heard, and for that we can launch the EWC campaign, we can launch the BE campaign, we can launch the Power to the People campaign, we can fight for vaccines because the Friends of the IR make it possible. So whenever I can, I really must say, just thank you to the Friends, because it's thanks to you that we can actually reach the millions of people that we want to and that we are reaching, to change the climate of ideas and just have people pause and consider, perhaps we should give freedom a shot.
Right. I just want to say very briefly, apologies to the audience if you can hear a very slight scratching sound. I see that Hermann's microphone appears to be rubbing against his collar. But, this is the first time I think how badly dressed we are has ever affected the quality of the podcast. But all right, last minute here. Any final thoughts, Duwayne, on some of the things we've been doing? What's been the most exciting for you?
The most exciting has definitely been the EWC campaign, simply because it's so pressing and because the need for the campaign is so strong. And I don't think I can say this in strong enough terms, the need for everyone to get involved in this campaign. I think we are now, even though, as you said, if this bill passes, it will not be the end of the fight, but we do have the opportunity to stop the government in their tracks and just make them doubt, because that's what we want to do. France says, once you plant doubt into someone's head, it stays and it nags, and I think that's what we want to do.
Right, and I think you can see that the battle of ideas at a sort of more at the broader level is beginning to change. You really don't see a lot of strong proponents actually arguing for the mechanics of expropriation without compensation these days. It seems a lot more muted. There's a lot more kind of, let's just get this through before people get too organized kind of thing. So yeah,
or too involved and informed.
Right, exactly. So the more civil society joins in, businesses, whether it's other civil society organizations like AfriForum, political parties, they all have their role to play. And of course, citizens do too. Anyway, that's enough call to actions for today. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found this inspiring and encouraging in the fight to preserve liberty. Like Hermann said, if you want to help us out, go to the IRL website, click the campaigns button, click the join us button, and yeah, sign up to help us defend the Bill of Rights, because of course the right to private property is in the Bill of Rights. It is a core right. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. We shall of course be back tomorrow for the final episode of the Daily Friend for this week. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and we will see you around. Cheers, everyone.